Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. I'm Senator Jonathan Lindsay. I called this press conference to basically ask some questions about economic development projects that have been going on here in the state of Michigan. Last week, the Economic and Community Development Committee hearing, I had an exchange with the CEO of the MEDC about the process by which they evaluate potential projects. Shortly after that committee presentation, the CEO told the media that, quote, "We are being much more aggressive about trying to understand ownership structure." He went on to say this included discerning whether U.S. subsidiaries of Chinese companies have independent boards or, quote, the engagement of any shareholder with the Chinese Communist Party. This was a step in the right direction. The MEDC committing to a more rigorous vetting process for projects is critical, and I look forward to it. But part of what we're going to do today is highlight some of what has gone on, as well as share some relatively new developments that basically come down to a common theme. If we pursue economic development projects here in Michigan, there should be a rigorous vetting process. It should not only consider national security concerns, but things like environmental concerns. It should, of course, start with the question of whether this is a good deal for the people of Michigan. But yes, a lot of attention has been placed, especially on the national security angle of this, and I think rightly so. So we're going to hear from today a couple of guests. We're joined by Ambassador Joe Cella, Ambassador Pete Hoekstra, Representatives Fink, Green, Martin, and Meerman, who all sort of have their own perspective on this. And I think we'll also get to hear about some very recent developments that are concerning, and they continue to raise more questions about these development projects. So again, thank you all for coming. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ambassador Joe Cella.
Thank you, Senator Lindsay. Thank you for your hospitality and hosting us, and all of your leadership, representatives on this important issue. My former ambassadorial colleague, Peter Hoekstra. The Ambassador Hoekstra and I co-founded the Michigan China Economic and Security Review Group a couple of months ago to monitor, assess, and report on the threats, potential threats, or emerging threats from the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party, its entities, affiliates, and their associates, including PRC-based companies, through subnational incursions and presence in other forms, and assist in mitigating and reducing those threats to the state of Michigan. This work is done on a bipartisan basis, educating local and state elected officials and federal elected officials, helping in the protection of our state and national security, and ensuring Article 1, Section 1 of the Michigan Constitution and the charge of the preamble of the U.S. Constitution of our citizens, and to provide are upheld and fortified the security and protection of our citizens, and to provide for our common defense. As volunteers, citizen advocates, and Michigan taxpayers, we've been working diligently with these good state legislators and other citizens that are here from both Calhoun County as well as Mecosta County to ask the necessary questions that have never been asked over the course of nearly 2 years now. And that involves wherever any reasonable or potential concerns exist involving threats to our national security surrounding the Gotion project and other tax-funded projects that are underway. As the state of Michigan and other parties advocating for these projects have refused to perform. Some parties have even derisively mocked our suggestion that there is even a national security threat, and there is. Last year, our intelligence agencies met with state and local officials, warning them of the threat the PRC-based companies tied to the CCP present to our national security, and urging them to not sign any such deals. It's unconscionable that Governor Whitmer, the MEDC, and all parties supporting the Gotion project and other projects have done the exact opposite, and to the peril of our national security. From the Foreign Agents Registration Act, known as FARA, to the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, known as CFIUS, transparency has been violated with these projects, as has possibly the law, and there certainly has been a gross disregard for our national security, which continues to this day. Mr. Quentin Messer, the CEO of MEDC, and Mr. Josh Hunt, the MEDC Chief Projects Officer, recently gave assurances of the integrity of the project's processes, that due diligence, quote-unquote, exhaustive due diligence, had been conducted, and based on the judgment of Gotion's, quote-unquote, business credibility or company credibility, and on account of, quote, public board meetings and approvals, while casually expressing we feel good about this company. All of that notwithstanding, when this project began 2 years ago, Messer and Hunt and all parties involved failed to ask these basic questions and take the most basic steps to protect the security of our state and our nation. Senator Lindsay pointed to last week that pretty much turned on a 180, where they were apparently being more mindful of this threat, and because geopolitics have been changing. This didn't happen 2 weeks ago, it didn't happen 2 months ago, it didn't happen 2 years ago. It's been a long time since. And you can't help but ask what is exactly going on here. Why that detachment? Why not being stewards of taxpayers' dollars and doing some serious, just honest introspection, very basic introspection? Particularly considering the intelligence agencies have specifically warned state agencies and officials to not sign any such deal on account of the national security threat. So I would ask the MEDC in the right place, will they submit themselves as parties to the Gotion project to a full CFIUS review, which is different than a voluntary declaration. I can get into that detail later in questions and answer. Or are they asking these questions on their own that Mr. Messer referred to in the committee? State and local governments cannot be sovereign entities when it comes to our national security. And I would also ask them, will they publicly declare if there are any individuals in the party to the project who are in violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act? The PRC and the CCP on our shores are a subnational threat, often beyond the eyes of the U.S. government. No PRC-based company escapes the reach of the Chinese Communist Party, whether in their offices on mainland China. For instance, the parent company of Gotion, Inc. is known as Gotion High-Tech Company Limited, and its holding company, Nanjing Gotion Holdings Group Company Limited, the California-based subsidiary, or a manufacturing plant. They are all subject to the PRC's National Intelligence Law, Articles 9, 10, 11, and 13, requiring the PRC nationals at any time to be directed to surveil, collect, and report on anything at any time as directed. And unregistered foreign agents can do the bidding of the PRC and the CCP in any number of ways. At that same hearing last week, Mr. Messer said, quote, generational bets are being made and we want to make sure that Michigan has what it takes. We've got to win. But when the Whitmer administration through Messer is gambling on our national security, has put the chips on CCP-type companies who are bad actors by history, the United States will lose and Michigan will lose. Local leaders are hearing leaders of the Gotion project now downplaying its national security risk, saying Gotion is not in the war business and none of the facilities support anything associated with arms, quote unquote. This reflects an entirely unserious and unknowledgeable posture of all parties that they've had with respect to the necessary best practices, strict scrutiny, and due diligence due and owed required for such a transaction, particularly considering the grave threat our national intelligence agencies consider them to be through these companies. Pivoting now, in 2010, the U.S. Department of Defense called Afghanistan Saudi Arabia of lithium after American geologists then discovered that the country's lithium deposits there amounted to at least $1 trillion. If there's the remotest chance a company in the state of Michigan is hoping to subsidize a PRC-based company with ties to the CCP and is possibly working a deal with the Taliban regime, you have to take a serious look. You have to ask the questions. This is part of the serious vetting process, again, that hasn't happened, that should be subjected to the CFIUS process, which hasn't happened in 2 years by all parties to this project. So I will take this moment to turn it over to my former ambassadorial colleague, Ambassador Peter Hoekstra, for further.
Thanks. Yep. To our friends from the grassroots, thank you for being here. Hallelujah for grassroots. The embarrassing thing is so often they're much smarter than what we were in Washington or what people are in Lansing. So my hats are off to you. You know, freedom is a great value. It allows people and individuals in our country, it allows companies to excel and do awesome things. It also allows them to do stupid things. It allows individuals and companies to be patriotic, and it allows them to do other things. And we're seeing that all at play here when we're talking about these battery plants and the investment of $4 billion of Michigan taxpayer money. You know, it was last summer that we had the director of the FBI and the head of MI5, roughly the equivalent of the FBI in the UK. They did a joint press conference. And you think, oh, they've probably done that a number of times. First time in history. They'd come out on a platform and delivered a consistent message between the U.S. and the UK. The topic, China. The audience, business leaders. The message, this is about you, the business leaders. The Chinese Communist Party, China, People's Republic of China, however you want to label it, they're after your secrets, your business, and you are the ones that are at risk. Obviously, in my time that I served on the Intelligence Committee, I also know that the government is at risk. But the message was very clear. U.S., UK, European businesses, our allies in Asia, your businesses are at risk. Our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, recently said, I'm just paraphrasing, said, you know, when you look at the business community in China, don't look at it through the American lens, where there is a difference and a distinction between the private sector and the government sector. In China, there's no distance between the two. Gordon Chang, who is a China expert, says you've got a fusion. You've got a fusion between the private, in China you've got a fusion between the private sector and the government, including the military. They're one and the same. You need to understand that context when you start talking about Gotion, or, you know, any of these things, cattle. This is the mentality of China. Businesses are there to serve the interest of the government. The interest of the government is the Chinese Communist Party and their agenda. So, a number of us have been working on this, concerned about these two battery projects that are going on and other projects going on in the state. But right now, those are at the forefront. We've highlighted our concerns about the secrecy, the national security issues, and those types of things. And then over the weekend, we see another development. Not a surprising one. We knew that Afghanistan was rich in minerals and those types of things. And we see that the Taliban is negotiating with a company called Gotion, which it's nobody can find exactly because of the phonetic spelling and these types of things. So we're trying to make the connections right now, but it doesn't matter. It is a Chinese Communist Party controlled entity that is negotiating with the Taliban for access to lithium, and they're looking at signing close to a $10 billion contract. So in America, individuals and companies are free to do stupid and unpatriotic things. The state of Michigan is not. They have to be held to a higher standard. They are taking $400 from every single individual in the state of Michigan, and they are proposing that they transfer those resources over to the Chinese Communist Party. For a family of 5, it says we're taking $2,000 from your family. We're giving it to Gotion. We're giving it to Ford. We're giving it to other entities. But ultimately, this money, and it's not a very long path, and it's not very difficult to connect. That money finds its way to the Chinese Communist Party, and then it will find its way to Afghanistan to close a deal with the Taliban. And then the stuff that they're mining will find its way back to the United States of America and may then be eligible for tax credits for $7,500 or $3,750 if you're buying the right kind of vehicle or product. And so more money goes back to the Chinese Communist Party. It's not a great investment for the state of Michigan, and it's not very patriotic. Yesterday, the Treasury Department came out and established new rules and guidelines for who's going to be eligible for these incentives for electric vehicles. And the target of the Treasury Department rules and regulations is to make sure that that money does not go back to the Chinese Communist Party. I applaud what the Secretary of the Treasury did yesterday. Focusing on the threat from China in Washington is a bipartisan focus. It's Secretary Blinken, it's the Director of the FBI, it's the Secretary of the Treasury, who are all focused on the threat. It seems like the only place that is putting taxpayer dollars into the pocket of the Chinese Communist Party is here in the state of Michigan. These projects started 18 to 24 months ago. The relationship between the U.S. and China was very different then than what it is now. Now is a time for the governor, the Senate, the state legislature to just step back and put a pause and say, what has changed in the last 18 to 24 months that we need to take a look at? And I am confident that after they take a look at the changes in what has happened in the geopolitical atmosphere, the answer will be not now, not ever, taking Michigan taxpayer dollars and sending them to the Chinese Communist Party and then to the Taliban is really a bad idea. The grassroots figured this out months ago. As they get more information, they will get more energized. And America works because people in government listen to what people at the local level say. So again, thank you for your efforts. We're along for the ride, all right? And we're trying to help in every way we can to make sure that Michigan, the governor, and the legislature all come down on the right side of this issue. And that is, we stand with the people of Michigan, and we will be patriotic and support the state of Michigan and the objectives of the United States of America. So thank you very much. Representative Fink.
Thank you all for being here, and thanks to the ambassadors for being here, and Senator Lindsay for hosting us from the House here. I want to pick up on several of the themes that you've already begun to hear about, especially from the remarks that Ambassador Hoekstra just made. What should it mean that the Chinese national intelligence law requires Chinese-based companies to cooperate with their intelligence gathering efforts? What should that mean to the state of Michigan? What should it mean that I think it was 184 Democrats at the end of last month in Congress voted with the majority in the House of Representatives to prohibit CCP ownership of farmland? Why would they do that? What should that mean to us? What should it mean that this situation with the Taliban is, of course, an example of the Chinese government's Belt and Road Initiative, wherein they make investments in developing economies for the purpose of building a dependence on the Chinese economy in those developing places. And that part of the pitch for this project has been that, well, Mecosta County is one of the poorest places in Michigan. What should that mean? What should that indicate to us? Well, in some cases, these questions have been asked and left unanswered by the majority in the legislature and by the administration. Representative Schuette asked at an appropriations hearing a few weeks ago, where the Appropriations Committee agreed with the SOAR transfer for the Gotion project. Does Gotion or does the Chinese government consider this part of their Belt and Road Initiative? No answer. When we were in that hearing, I was not even given the opportunity to ask the question of what does it mean to the to the administration, to the majority, what does it mean that the national intelligence law says that Gotion has to cooperate with the intelligence gathering efforts of the Chinese government? I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's controversial to say that China identifies the United States of America as its primary global adversary, or if you want to put some kind of softer language on it, certainly competitor. If you think they're not attempting to gather information here, sorry, that's very naive. So what should we do about that? And the answer is that when we ask the questions, we're being told that we're conspiracy theorists and that we're play acting at national security. I mean, we heard that explicitly from one of the members of the Appropriations Committee in the House. We also heard that when we say that we should be careful about picking winners and losers as a matter of state policy, that was a foolish and naive perspective to have, because you know who picks winners? China. Again, this is said in an appropriations hearing here. We have to act like them in order to compete with them. So these questions being unanswered, and now adding to it this potential issue of a direct connection, but certainly, as Ambassador Hoekstra said, an eventual connection with a project like a $10 billion contract with the Taliban. I mean, if we can't take the time to vet the project, think through these questions, and ensure that we're not making Michigan taxpayers complicit with activities that Michigan taxpayers do not want to be complicit in, then how can we consider ourselves serious policymakers? That's the essential question here, is what is our responsibility, and are we willing to take the time and put the mental energy into being cautious about it? And the answer so far has been no. In fact, if you'd raise a question with an advocate of this project, and probably others, but certainly the Gotion project, what you find out is that the premises stated that lead to the conclusion that the project is a good project, if you question those premises, then they'll just change the premises, but the conclusion remains the same. And that is that we've got to do this, and if you disagree, we'll name call you, we'll say you're not serious, even though these examples I've given, like the Democrats in Washington supporting a prohibition of the CCP from owning farmland, like the national intelligence law in China explicitly requiring this kind of cooperation. Those things are open source. I'm not relying on anything that you couldn't look up right now. Right? And yet, we're getting name called and said that we're not serious, rather than simply engaging in the question. And if it's so obvious that it's a good project, these should be easy questions to answer. That's I think, where we're at. The state's refusing to really evaluate this and demonstrate that we're willing to do the hard work that I don't think it's simply the people from these communities. I know it's not it's not just the people from these communities. And I also think, by the way, that it's really not just Republicans. I mean, I think it's unfortunate that in this case you only see Republicans here, because as the ambassador said, and as I've just talked about in this farmland vote, this is, if you're being serious about national security, this is far from a partisan perspective. So with that, I will turn it over to, I think it's Representative Meerman is next. Is that right? Martin? Rep. Martin?
Thank you, David Martin, out of the 60th House District, homed in Davison. I just want to give a little bit of background and some credentials for why I've started thinking this way. And after the initial vote for the appropriations, it ran through a discharge from committee, no floor speeches, and then we had to vote on it. One of the first things we did in this session. And we were told that conglomerates were part of this, and it was European companies and domestic companies. But when you get down and dig into it, it really isn't, and their terms don't last very long, which turns it all back over to the Chinese Communist Party. Like my colleagues, veteran colleagues up here, Navy veteran Representative Jamie Green and Marine Corps veteran Andrew Fink, we started our military career here in Michigan. I swore my first oath in Detroit, Michigan, May 19th, 1979, and I swore to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I continued that several times. I took a re-enlistment oath here in the state of Michigan in Oscoda at Wurtsmith Air Force Base. Same thing. Going to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. When I became my elected duties, I swore to support the Constitution, and I mean to continue to do that. And I after I graduated from the NCO Academy and took the Senior NCO Academy in the Air Force and had global international affairs were part of those curriculum. And then I retired from the Air Force and I took a Homeland Security course and graduated from Kaiser University. And when I look at the things that are being done by the Communist Party, after I sat in the Fulda Gap fighting against the Soviet Union and saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, we need to do the same thing to make sure that people of China can spread their democratic wings and get a voice and not just hear the Communist Party in China. So I will stand against this and continue to fight for not only the rights of the people here, that we don't get jobs taken away from Michiganders, that we don't have incursions from foreign agents in this country. We need to take a deep look at this and be serious about national security and know what we're dealing with, because I've watched the spread of communists and I've seen it shrink again. And when there's a vacuum, somebody else is going to replace it, and it appears to be the Chinese communists. So now I'm going to turn over to Luke Meerman.
Thank you, Representative Martin, and all those who've gone before me. I'm grateful to stand here in this spot with you. We have a citizens legislature here in Michigan, and I'm a dairy farmer by trade. And so some would ask, why are you standing here? You're in the Michigan legislature. This is a federal thing. And to the point of Representative Martin, I also swore an oath to serve the people of the state of Michigan here, serve the 89th district. And that's why I'm grateful to stand here, because what I see is a real threat from the Chinese Communist Party. And let me be clear, I appreciate the Chinese people immensely. I use many of their products every single day. I think they're an important trading partner. But the idea that we are standing here considering giving $400 out of every one of our pockets, that I think at the end of the day will end up in the pockets of the Chinese Communist Party. Again, not concerned about the Chinese people. I'm concerned about the Communist Party. That is why I stand here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to stand with people behind me. So I think we just need to take a pause, and we need to take a look at that and say, what are we doing as the people in the state of Michigan? Thank you, Ambassador.
Well, thank you all again. Thank you to all of our speakers who have shared their own perspective. I want to return to one of the sort of newer pieces of information that some of you may have heard about at this press conference, is this potential linkage between the sourcing of lithium mining in Afghanistan in partnership with the Taliban. There is a more specific reason that I called this press conference. It is personal to me. About a decade ago, I was serving in Afghanistan, and I happened to be the only person on my Special Forces team who learned the language of the locals. I learned Dari and Farsi, and it gave me some unique opportunities to talk with people and ask villagers what's going on. In one of those interactions, I had a sort of shocking revelation to me by one of the locals claiming that one of the areas in which we wouldn't go conduct patrols, there was a Chinese mining operation there. And while we never were able to go and confirm what exactly was going on, the idea was just shocking. And I've read about this several times. You can look back over the last decade or 15 years of this idea that the Chinese Communist Party has, not just under the current regime of the Taliban taking back over in Afghanistan, but for years. They have done what they can to try to exploit these sorts of situations. So when I think about what could happen here in Michigan, where we, the taxpayers of Michigan, could end up paying money for an economic development program that could result in that money going up through a supply chain and, supporting entities in China while they're doing business with the Taliban, I think that's a shocking idea. Of course, we don't know the full relationship between all of these entities. I myself, when I saw one of the press releases out of Afghanistan, was doing my best I was reading a release from the Ministry of Petroleum and Mining there, and there was a translation from Dari to English. It's challenging. The way I was able to read the original Dari made me think that there is no distinction phonetically between the word they're trying to describe. You could read it as Gotion, you can read it however you want. Somebody translated it and said it's going to be spelled a little bit different than the company we're most familiar with in China. But nevertheless, I think that the concerns merit, as we've heard from a lot of people today, they merit further investigation. They certainly, I believe, have brought us to a point in the Michigan legislature where we should be pumping the brakes on this project. We're still facing a potential transfer request vote from the Senate Appropriations about this. I think that should be entirely off the table. and I think we should go back to the drawing board and really build out some tools to do a deep dive evaluation of this partnership and this project. I'm going to wrap it up there and open up for questions. I would just ask that folks, if you have a question, please, not everyone up here knows who everyone is, so let us know who you are and direct your question at who you would like to hear from.
I'll just speak from the federal side of the ledger, and I'll have any of these good people from the state side of ledger speak, and that is any well-informed corporate citizen, any responsible corporate citizen, any steward of taxpayer dollars know what's involved with due diligence, and they have lawyers to counsel them on that. Strict scrutiny, best practices exist. You can find it on Google. With this, from the outset, at the time the NDAs and code names started to roll out about 18 months ago, integrated into that process should have been a checkbox for a full CFIUS review. Department of Treasury entity, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, established in 1975, to investigate thoroughly potential national security threats by foreign investments. Read Gotion, read Cattle, read Eagle Township, and that hasn't done. I think this is a great opportunity for these good legislators to lead, I think, plug that gap, pass policies that could require that, and perhaps one of them could speak to that.
From my perspective, I mean, when we had this committee hearing last week on the policy side of economic community development, I think this is what we sort of landed on, right? Mr. Messer sort of identified the process that they use right now, and the questions, they weren't just about this. There were questions from the other side of the aisle about, do we do enough to go and ask local communities whether they want these projects? And so I sort of landed on where I landed on it was, it doesn't seem to me that the process, especially SOAR, was ever designed to really tell MEDC that you need to go and do these things. That's where I hope we move. I hope we can make some policy changes that direct them to do a series of reviews. I think you heard from the ambassador on national security. If they want to try to plug into a system like CFIUS at the national level, that may make a lot of sense. I would also like to see them doing direct contact with, for instance, installations in the area that may have their own concerns about this, right? So if we have an Air National Guard base close to a development project, I think that it should be on the checklist to go reach out and say, what concerns do you have about this, and how can we get your sort of blessing to say this is okay. So I think there's a lot of room to kind of put more guardrails on the process, and I think it was pretty clear in the committee hearing last week that that's just not how MEDC was approaching it. They were approaching it from, we just need to win, right? And I'm not going to say that they don't care about these issues, but that was not their directive. So I think there's a lot of improvement that we can do, and I hope we will. I think Representative Fink.
Yeah, the only supplement I provide here is we already know that there are differences between different sources of economic activity. We have in Michigan the Iran Sanctions Act, which essentially prohibits the state or political subdivisions of the state from contracting with Iran-affiliated or Iran-linked businesses. And if you're doing your contracting at the local level, you've got to get a certification from the vendor that it is not an Iran-linked business for purposes of the Iran Sanctions Act. So we already know how to make a distinction between, say, a South Korean or a French company and Iran. I think it's simple enough for us to say that we should develop a way to evaluate projects from involving a Chinese entity, for the reasons that we've already stated here. That might be someplace in between the Iran Sanctions Act and how we would look at a contract with a Canadian company. But the bottom line is that there's, to this point, been a refusal to even acknowledge that we might need to consider making a distinction like that. You have a follow-up? It doesn't seem to me it should be necessary for there to be a ballot proposal for the state of Michigan to take this seriously. I mean, there's no need for there to be a ballot proposal if the legislature and the administration take their responsibility that they already have, as Ambassador Cella said, under Article 1, Section 1 of our Constitution, to keep the security of our state first and foremost. So I mean, a well-done ballot proposal could be helpful for policy, but it is certainly not necessary if the policy makers that the people have already taken the time to elect take the responsibility seriously.
I just want to add a point. After my 10 years on the Intel Committee, serving as chairman and the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee for 6.5 years, CFIUS is not a foolproof process. I don't want to leave you with the expectation that, well, if CFIUS comes back and says, it's okay, all right, it's like, oh, phew, now we can move ahead. It is one piece of a federal government input. What MEDC needs to go through in their vetting process is a deep dive into the national security implications of these kinds of things. As I said, it was just, 5-6 months ago that in a bipartisan way, Congress decided that they were going to invest $52 billion into what? Chip manufacturing. And to reestablish an expanded capability here in the United States. I don't know what happened over in CFIUS over that for the last 10 years as different projects were put in place and decisions were made to source chip manufacturing in other places. But clearly, at the federal level, we failed because we put ourselves in a position where we were dependent on someone else for a key component, chip manufacturing. Joe and I saw the same thing with COVID, either in the Netherlands or in the Pacific. We found ourselves dependent on China for PPG, personal protective gear. Saw the same thing here in the United States. The CFIUS, the federal government process, had failed. We found that when we got to a pandemic, we were relying on China. So that process is not foolproof. The federal government has demonstrated an inability to grasp the identity of potential threats on the horizon. And if you can't see this threat emerging on electric vehicles, that we're investing in growing China's capability in electric vehicles rather than investing in our own capability or the capability of our allies, so that we won't be in a position in 10 years where, there's a conflict and some envision, that we're going to have tanks that run on batteries, and someone says, oh, shoot, China's on the other side. They're not going to send us batteries anymore. Some of it is just common sense, but I think all of these national security concerns have just been ignored by the MEDC, and they're looking at the local level and saying, hey, we can create some jobs, and that's a good thing. It needs to be a much deeper dive on a much bigger level.
One other point, just in terms of the CFIUS review, as many of you may know, Big Rapids Charter Township filed a CFIUS review. They petitioned the Department of Treasury. It's pending. Party to the project, they're justified. CFIUS came back and said, we need this information on Gotion shareholders. We need their passports, their visas, their dates of birth, their names, and to get a part of it. So I guess it's been covered in the press that I guess by Chuck Thalen has said we're going to submit voluntarily to this. So they submitted to something, but it is yet to be the full CFIUS review. And I'll just read you some minutes from the Big Rapids Township meeting that happened on the 14th, I believe. And it said that the attorney noted that the township's review had come back requesting more information regarding to Gotion shareholders and owners. This is CFIUS. Such information as visas, passports, names, addresses, birth date. Because this information was not available to the township directed their attorney to submit a formal request to Gotion, their attorneys to do the following. 1, ask Gotion and their representatives to supply the township with the information requested by the CFIUS review. 2, participate with Big Rapids Township filing jointly, possibly, to supply the information needed to complete the CCP review, or to file a complete review of the CFIUS themselves. So the reply from Gotion's attorney was to refuse all three of those options. Why? Noting that they would in turn file a declaration to the CFIUS review. So he noted that the declaration was not a complete review, comparing it to their attorney, Big Rapids, noted that comparing it to a much shorter version of the information that CFIUS was requesting. He was made aware that they in fact submitted a declaration, however, it also had to be kicked back to Gotion's attorneys for lack of information. So that's hanging out there. They need to disclose and disclose now. NBC could weigh in, they could file their own full CFIUS review to get this done. I mean, these are just continued game playings, lack of transparency that now is approaching 2 years, and the taxpayers of Michigan, the citizens in these townships deserve a lot better. So that's.
Let's just take one more, and then I think a lot of people here are going to be available afterwards. But what's your question? Yeah. Just personally, every time I hear that sort of argument, right, we have to partner with this particular country because of this technology. I mean, I interpret that as sort of a admission by people that they think the people of America are somehow inferior, and we can't create, we can't innovate, we can't come to these same sorts of technologies. Now, I know what they're pointing out is that it's the current moment, right? This is the state of play right now, that the development has been done in other places. But I think it's fair to say, you look back through our history and look at some of these times when, we were completely behind developing certain things prior to World War II, and then we jumped in and became the leaders, right? And so there's been sort of a long-standing, I feel, sort of sentiment that American greatness is done. Right? We can't make chips, we can't make batteries, I reject it completely. I think that we can make everything that's made in the world. I think we can do it as well or better than anyone else. And I think we should. I think what it comes down to is we should be investing in those sorts of things and driving towards the technology of the future, not giving up and saying the only place we can source this is from our greatest geopolitical foe. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that, but
I think it's a great question. Thank you. Thanks, Senator. It was a great answer. It's like, hallelujah, what a great question. It's the chips industry, except 10 years earlier in the process. Now is the time, if we're going to make this move that the president is putting us down the road that he's putting us on, of being dependent and reliant on electrical vehicles. Now is the time for the president to propose a Manhattan Project for the United States of America and our allies to make sure that in 10 years we are leading the world in this technology. What a great opportunity. So rather than funneling $4 billion to take an emerging industry and strengthen China's position in that industry, take the $4 billion and invest it in our best and brightest companies right here in Michigan and the United States to get them moving. Okay, we've got battery technology here in the state of Michigan from companies that our allies are located in our allied countries. Grow them. Bring the leadership, exactly as the senator said. Bring the leadership to America. Don't fund continued growth and development in the countries that will hold us hostage in the future.
The only thing I'd add here is that Michigan deciding that it's got to be at the forefront of battery technology, that's a choice. Michigan deciding to make similar kind of policy decisions that Ambassador Hoekstra just referred to the President making, that we're going to be sort of directing automation towards electric vehicles. That's a choice. If we're making those choices despite not even really reviewing or considering the national security questions that we've talked about today, that's an irresponsible choice. If we should be doing electric vehicles, then we should be doing it knowing what the ancillary consequences are. If we're going to be doing electric vehicles or battery manufacturing here in Michigan as a major effort of the MEDC and the state government, then we have to do it with our eyes open. We have to know what we're talking about. So I look at it as a question that is sort of buried within it are premises like, well, we have to do these electric vehicle projects on this timeline that's pretty artificially set up. I mean, look, what are we supposed to be? Carbon neutral by 2050? How old will you be in 2050? Right? I mean, these are promises that are being made to kind of direct the way our economy has to move today, that it really isn't connected to anything that's actually happening in real life, but it's causing us to make choices in real life that aren't really being calculated in a way that you can show the work. I mean, so that's I guess what I would say is that it's an option that the state is kind of choosing, and if we're choosing it, then we should be able to explain why.
This is a little bit back to your good question and Samantha's earlier. I think this is another opportunity for a prospective policy change where Michigan could, in light of the existential threat that presented by the PRC and the CCP and the adversarial nature, is that the state could put policy requiring that we have preferred partners in manufacturing first. So that could be South Korea, LG, Japan, and Panasonic. They have LG technologies, and they have LG plants. So those friends, allies, partners, countries should always be turned to first, and I think that's another opportunity for a prospective state policy change.
All right, we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you all again for coming. I think some of us will stick around, or you certainly can reach out to our offices if you have further questions or want to have any side interviews or conversations. So thank you all again for coming. Thank you to the ambassadors and our representatives for joining me. Have a good rest of your day.